Petaluma, California. The night of October 1st, 1993, 12-year-old Polly Klaas was doing exactly what 12-year-old girls do on ordinary Friday nights all over the world. Hosting a sleepover. Two of her friends had come over, and the three of them had taken over Polly's bedroom for the evening, the way kids do, turning an entire house into their own small kingdom for one night, full of the kind of ordinary chatter and giggling and half-watched movies that make up a completely unremarkable Friday in the life of any middle schooler. Polly's mother, Eve, was asleep in a nearby room, close enough that in any ordinary version of that night, nothing about the distance between her and her daughter's bedroom would have mattered at all. This was Petaluma, a quiet, close-knit city where families genuinely believed a night like this one carried no particular risk at all. The kind of place where a 12-year-old having friends over felt as safe and unremarkable as it possibly could. Around 10:30 that night, a man none of the three girls had ever seen before walked directly into Polly's bedroom. He was carrying a knife he'd taken from the kitchen on his way in. He told the girls, in what witnesses would later describe as an almost eerily calm tone, that he wasn't there to hurt anyone, that he only wanted money. He tied up Polly's two friends, pulled pillowcases over their heads, and told them to count to 1,000 before making a sound. And then he took Polly and walked out of the house with her, into the dark, while her mother slept close enough to have heard almost anything else happening that night except this. By the time Polly's friends worked up the courage to pull those pillowcases off and realize what had actually happened, the man was gone, and so was Polly. They ran to wake Polly's mother, and within minutes, what had been an ordinary sleepover had become a police emergency unfolding in real time, in a bedroom that, hours earlier, had held nothing more threatening than teenage laughter. What followed was one of the largest volunteer search efforts in American history to that point, and a nightmare that would stretch on, unresolved, for the next 2 months. Before we go further into that search, and into everything that came after it, I want you to understand who Polly Klaas actually was, because this case, more than almost any other from that era, became so thoroughly absorbed into national headlines and legislative debates that the actual 12-year-old girl at the center of it can get lost entirely. She was, by every account left behind, an ordinary kid in the best possible sense. She loved being around her friends. She was close with her mother, and on the single most unremarkable night imaginable, a Friday sleepover in her own bedroom, her life was taken from her by a complete stranger who had simply decided, for reasons that still don't fully make sense to anyone, that her house was the one he'd walk into that night. She had an entire ordinary adolescence still ahead of her, the kind most 12-year-olds take completely for granted. Middle school dances and driver's permits, and whatever version of adulthood she might eventually have grown into. None of that was hers to have. Petaluma is a small city north of San Francisco, and this crime detonated through it immediately. Within days, roughly 4,000 volunteers had mobilized to search the surrounding hills, forests, and fields for any sign of Polly, an effort that would go on to become one of the largest civilian search operations in American history to that point. Flyers went out nationally, not just locally, carrying her photograph and a composite sketch built from her two friends' description of the man who'd taken her. Command centers were set up, staffed almost entirely by volunteers coordinating search grids the way a small army might. Ordinary parents and neighbors who simply refused to sit at home while a child from their own community remained missing. Local businesses closed for days so employees could join the search. Schools organized their students into letter-writing campaigns, sending postcards with Polly's photo to newspapers up and down the West Coast. The case became known across the country as the search for America's child, a phrase the media coined and one that stuck, because something about a 12-year-old girl taken out of her own bedroom during a sleepover, with her mother sleeping just down the hall, struck an entire nation as a violation of the most basic assumption of safety a family can have. Petaluma had its own famous daughter helping carry that search forward too. Actress Winona Ryder, who'd grown up in the town, personally offered a $200,000 reward for information leading to Polly's safe return, and used her own public platform to keep the case in front of as many people as possible, appearing at press conferences alongside Polly's family and speaking about the search in national interviews. For weeks, none of it produced Polly. It did, however, almost produce her killer, weeks before anyone realized it. The man responsible, it would later become clear, was almost a textbook case of exactly the kind of offender a functioning justice system is supposed to be able to identify and contain. Richard Allen Davis had a documented criminal history stretching back into the early 1970s, including multiple convictions for kidnapping, assault, and burglary, several of which involved young women and girls specifically. He had been released on parole more times than his case file could comfortably justify, each release made by a parole board working within a system that, at the time, had no mechanism forceful enough to keep a man with his exact pattern of behavior off the streets permanently. He was, by the time he walked into Polly's bedroom that October night, exactly the kind of repeat violent offender whose continued freedom would soon become the single loudest argument in California's biggest criminal justice debate in a generation. In the middle of that search, a Sonoma County Sheriff's deputy responded to a call about a car stuck in the mud on a rural property not far from Petaluma. The driver, cooperative and unremarkable, needed help getting his vehicle free. The deputy helped him, checked his information in a way that, at the time, didn't flag anything urgent enough to hold him, and sent him on his way. That driver was Richard Allen Davis, a man on parole with a criminal record stretching back more than 2 decades, full of prior convictions for kidnapping, burglary, and assault. A man the state's own parole system had released back into the world again and again, despite a documented history of exactly this kind of violence. He drove away from that muddy field a free man, weeks before anyone connected him to anything, and he continued moving through the same general area where the largest search in the region's history was actively looking for the very girl he'd taken. I want to pause here for a second because I think about this moment more than almost any other part of this case. A man with that history, stuck in the mud within a reasonable distance of where a 12-year-old girl had just been taken, cooperating politely with a deputy who had no way of knowing what he was looking at. It's the kind of missed connection that haunts an investigation forever afterward. Not because anyone did anything wrong exactly, but because the system simply didn't have the information, in that exact moment, to see what was standing right in front of it. Somewhere in a filing cabinet or a database that deputy didn't have reason to search that deeply, Davis's entire violent history already existed on paper. It just wasn't the kind of thing a routine roadside stop was built to surface. And so a man who would soon become one of the most reviled figures in modern California history simply thanked the deputy for his help and drove away. And while we're sitting with a detail like that, I do want to know who's watching this with me tonight. If you're here, drop your country and the time where you are in the comments below. I like knowing exactly how far a small town's tragedy in 1993 has traveled to reach you, wherever you're watching from tonight. More than 3 decades, and in many cases thousands of miles away from that muddy field outside Petaluma. Just your country and your time, and then let's get back to Petaluma. Because it would still take weeks more before anyone put Richard Allen Davis's name anywhere near this case. By early December, investigators recovered pieces of cloth near the site where Davis's car had gotten stuck, evidence that, once properly examined, connected directly back to him. On December 3rd, they arrested him, initially on a parole violation, the same quiet administrative machinery that had already failed to hold him once already that year. Investigators, working the case for 2 straight months without a solid break, moved quickly once his name resurfaced, cross-referencing the stuck car incident against the timeline of Polly's disappearance and realizing, for the first time, exactly how close that earlier encounter had come to solving everything weeks sooner. And then came the detail that broke the case open completely. A palm print recovered from a bed frame inside Polly's own bedroom from the night of the kidnapping matched Richard Allen Davis exactly. Confronted with a match that precise, there was no longer room for the kind of vague denial that might have worked against weaker evidence. Davis confessed. He described driving Polly around for hours that night before ultimately killing her. An account he gave with a chilling, detached calm that unsettled even the investigators taking his statement, describing the entire evening the way someone might describe a forgettable errand rather than the final hours of a child's life. He led police to a shallow grave in a wooded area near Cloverdale, roughly 30 miles from Petaluma, guiding officers through terrain he apparently remembered with unsettling precision for a man who claimed at points to have been too intoxicated to recall many other details of that night clearly. On December 4th, 1993, 2 months and 3 days after that ordinary Friday sleepover, Polly Klaas's body was recovered, and a search that had drawn in thousands of volunteers and an entire nation's attention finally, devastatingly, had its answer. For the volunteers who had spent 2 months walking search grids through California hillsides, the news landed less like a resolution and more like a confirmation of the worst possibility they'd been trying not to think about the entire time. The trial that followed didn't begin until 2.5 years later, in April of 1996. Delayed in part because finding an impartial jury in Sonoma County, where the case had consumed local life for years, proved close to impossible. The trial was ultimately moved to Santa Clara County. Prosecutors laid out a case built on the palm print, on the physical evidence recovered near the gravesite, and on Davis's own confession, while his defense argued for a lesser degree of culpability, attempting to characterize the killing as something other than the deliberate, premeditated act prosecutors described. Witnesses who had known Davis for years testified about his history, painting a portrait of a man who had cycled in and out of the justice system for 2 decades without ever facing consequences severe enough to stop him. Neither the defense's arguments nor the long, grim recitation of Davis's own record changed what the jury ultimately concluded. When the jury returned its verdict on June 18, 1996, finding Davis guilty of first-degree murder along with the special circumstances of kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and attempting a lewd act against a child, Davis responded, in front of the courtroom and the cameras covering it, by raising his middle finger toward the gallery, a gesture caught on camera and broadcast across the country within hours. He was sentenced to death. That single contemptuous gesture became almost as widely remembered as the crime itself. A small, ugly coda that told an entire watching country everything it needed to know about the man responsible for Polly's death. Polly's father, Mark Klaas, was in that courtroom, and he has spent every year since, publicly and relentlessly, refusing to let his daughter's name be forgotten, founding the Klaas Kids Foundation in her memory, dedicated to child safety advocacy nationwide, testifying before lawmakers, and showing up, decade after decade, in courtrooms connected to his daughter's case, still speaking for a 12-year-old girl who never got the chance to speak for herself again. And here is where Polly Klaas's case reaches beyond even the tragedy of one family, into something that reshaped an entire state's legal system. Richard Allen Davis's extensive history of prior violent convictions and the fact that he had nonetheless kept being released back onto parole again and again, right up until the night he walked into a 12-year-old's bedroom with a kitchen knife, became the central argument behind one of the most significant pieces of criminal justice legislation in American history, California's so-called Three Strikes Law, passed by the state legislature and overwhelmingly approved by voters in 1994, mandating dramatically longer sentences for repeat violent offenders. Lawmakers pointed directly at Davis's record, at every previous release, every parole board decision that had put him back on the street, as the exact pattern the new law was designed to interrupt permanently. Campaign materials for the ballot measure invoked Polly's case explicitly, and polling at the time showed overwhelming public support once voters connected the abstract policy debate to the specific, devastating story of one 12-year-old girl taken from her own bedroom by a man who never should have still been free. An entire generation of California's criminal sentencing policy exists, directly and explicitly, because of what happened in Polly Klaas's bedroom on one Friday night in October of 1993. Richard Allen Davis remains on death row today, more than 3 decades later, at San Quentin. California hasn't actually executed anyone since 2006, and since 2019, the state has operated under a formal moratorium on executions ordered by Governor Gavin Newsom, who has publicly called the death penalty a failure of the justice system that disproportionately affects the poor and mentally ill. In 2024, Davis's attorneys petitioned the court to have his death sentence formally recalled, citing changes in state sentencing law that have since eliminated certain sentencing enhancements. A judge denied that petition outright, and prosecutors called the underlying arguments nonsensical, noting that the specific laws being cited had never been intended to apply to a case like his. Mark Klaas, still showing up in courtrooms more than 30 years after his daughter's murder, told reporters afterward that there was, in his words, no place left for a man like Davis to go except exactly where he belonged, adding that he remained grateful the judge and prosecutors had been so decisive in denying yet another attempt to revisit a case his family believed had already been settled, definitively, decades earlier. There is something almost unbearably ordinary sitting at the center of this entire case, and I think it's worth naming directly. Polly Klaas wasn't taken from a dark alley, or a deserted road, or anywhere a family might reasonably brace themselves against danger. She was taken from her own bedroom, during a sleepover, with her mother asleep just down the hall, by a man the state itself had already released over and over, despite knowing exactly what he was capable of. The failure here wasn't Polly's, and it wasn't her mother's, and it wasn't her friends, who did everything 2 terrified children possibly could that night, following the exact instructions given to them by a man holding a knife, counting to 1,000 in the dark, waiting to see whether they would survive the night at all. The failure belonged to a system that kept letting Richard Allen Davis back out into a world full of Friday night sleepovers, until finally, it didn't have to answer for that failure quietly anymore, because an entire nation was watching. In the years since, the Klaas Kids Foundation has worked with law enforcement agencies and legislators across the country on child safety initiatives, missing persons protocols, and public awareness campaigns, all carrying Polly's name forward into exactly the kind of protective work that might have changed the outcome of her own case had it existed a little sooner. Mark Klaas has testified before Congress. He has stood beside other grieving parents at press conferences for children who disappeared decades after his own daughter did, offering the kind of steady, hard-won presence that only someone who has lived through exactly that nightmare can offer another family living through it for the first time. Polly's case, in that sense, never really ended in 1996 with a verdict, or in 1994 with a new law. It has continued, quietly, for more than 30 years, in every piece of legislation and every search effort that her name has since been attached to. Polly Klaas was 12 years old. She spent the last ordinary night of her life exactly the way a 12-year-old should be allowed to spend a Friday. Surrounded by her friends, in her own bedroom, in her own home, with her mother close enough to hear her if she'd called out. She never got to grow older than 12. She never got to see the law that would eventually carry her name into courtrooms across California for decades afterward. Never got to know that the worst night of her life would become the reason thousands of future victims might be spared a similar one. Her name now sits permanently attached to a law that changed how an entire state sentences the people most likely to do to someone else what was done to her. Rest in peace, Polly Klaas. See you in the next case.